Before America had restaurants, it had taverns. Not the polished kind with printed menus and soft music. The early tavern was louder, rougher, and more necessary. A place where a traveler could step out of the cold, stamp mud off his boots, and feel the heat of a wide hearth pushing back the night. Picture it, a swinging sign outside, painted with a name or an animal, creaking in the wind to tell strangers they had found shelter. A yard out back with horses and wagons tied up, the smell of hay and leather mixing with wood smoke. Inside, the taproom's long bar and barrels promised ale, cider, and rum, poured into mugs that looked like they had been held by 100 hands. And what many people forget is this. For a lot of Americans, this was the closest thing to eating out that existed. You didn't always order what you wanted. You ate what the house had, often at a common table with strangers, under candlelight and smoky rafters, while someone pinned fresh notices to a wall or read the latest news aloud. Sometimes, men played cards or dice to pass time. Sometimes a town meeting or court session happened right in that same room, because the tavern was where people gathered when the colony needed decisions. Tonight, we're stepping back into those rooms. 25 forgotten colonial tavern meals Americans ate before restaurants existed. Meals built for long roads, cold nights, and hard work. Some were humble, some were surprisingly rich. And one of the most unusual dishes was a sweet pudding that looked plain, but carried the taste of molasses and the patience of slow fire. Stay with me. We will get there. In the colonial era, taverns were more than food stops. They were community centers and travel hubs at the same time. A visitor might sleep upstairs in a small room if there was space, or simply rest by the fire until morning. A rider might leave a message, check posted announcements, or ask about the road ahead. A local might come for a mug and a meal, then stay for news, business, or a vote. Food mattered because travel was demanding and supplies were uncertain. Roads were rough and weather could trap people for days. Meat had to be salted or smoked. Vegetables had to be stored, pickled, or dried. Flour, cornmeal, beans, and dried peas were pantry lifelines. Tavern cooks worked with what they could get locally. Along coasts and rivers, fish and oysters appeared. Inland, pork, poultry, and game were more common. And because a tavern might suddenly receive a stagecoach full of hungry people, the best meals were the ones that could be cooked in large pots, baked ahead, or served quickly from stores that would not spoil. So as we move through these meals, imagine the reasons behind them. Not fashion, not trend, necessity, warmth, storage, scale, and a quiet promise that if you made it to the tavern door, you could sit down and eat. We begin with the kind of meal that made a tavern feel like shelter the moment you smelled it. Beef and ale stew was built for cold nights and hungry strangers. Tough cuts of beef simmered for hours with onions, herbs, and ale, thickened with a bit of flour or bread. People ate it because it was hot, filling, and forgiving. A cook could stretch it with more liquid and still serve a satisfying bowl. It mattered because slow cooking turned cheap meat tender, and one kettle could feed many. The human detail is the bread used like a spoon, dragged through the last dark broth while the fire crackles. From that stew pot, the next meal often arrived sealed in pastry, because pies could be made ahead and served fast. Chicken pie was baked with a simple gravy and whatever vegetables were available. One common variation used older stewing hens, onions, and herbs from the kitchen garden. People ate it because it tasted like home, even when home was far away, and it held heat well. It mattered because crust stretched meat and kept it moist, and pies were easy to portion for a crowded table. The human detail is the first cut into the crust, steam escaping, and everyone leaning forward as if warmth itself is being served. But what came next was even more tied to the coast, and to how taverns depended on local harvests. Oyster stew was a favorite where oysters were plentiful and cheap. Oysters simmered gently in milk or cream when available, with butter, pepper, and sometimes a bit of onion. People ate it because it felt rich without needing a roast, and it cooked quickly when a room filled with travelers. It mattered because taverns needed fast meals that still felt substantial. The human detail is the pepper shaken on top, a small flourish that made a humble bowl feel important under candlelight. From oysters, another seaborne meal often followed, especially in coastal taverns where a pot could feed a whole room. Fish chowder was built for scale. Salted fish or fresh catch, potatoes, onions, and a creamy broth when dairy was available, sometimes thickened with hard bread or crumbs. People ate it because fish could be plentiful and potatoes made the bowl filling for very low cost. It mattered because chowder stretched local ingredients into a steady, warming meal. The human detail is the kettle near the hearth, lid lifted for a quick stir, steam rising into the smoky rafters. If chowder was coastal comfort, preserved fish was the workday staple that could travel far inland. Salt cod with potatoes was common because salt cod stored well and could be shipped and bought in bulk. The fish was soaked, then cooked and served with potatoes and onions, with butter or drippings when the kitchen could spare it. People ate it because it was dependable protein when fresh meat was scarce. It mattered because preservation made feeding travelers possible in any season. The human detail is the strong smell in the room, familiar to everyone, and the quiet way people ate without complaint because it was simply the era. And when fish was preserved, another preserved dish sometimes appeared beside it, sharp and bracing. Pickled herring with onions was practical tavern food. Herring kept in brine or vinegar, served with sliced onions and bread. People ate it because it did not spoil quickly and offered a bold taste that cut through plain staples. It mattered because taverns needed foods that could be served even when fresh supplies were low. The human detail is the vinegar's sting in the air when the jar opens, waking up a tired traveler faster than cold water. From preserved fish, tavern tables often shifted back to pork because pork was the backbone of many colonial pantries. Boiled salt pork and cabbage was an everyday meal that fed working bodies. Salt pork simmered with cabbage, sometimes with turnips in some regions. People ate it because pork could be cured and stored, and cabbage lasted longer than most greens. It mattered because it delivered fat, salt, and calories in one pot. The human detail is the broth at the bottom, soaked up with bread because leaving it behind felt like leaving strength behind. That same thrift showed up in a dish that looked simple but carried whole regions through winter. Baked beans with brown bread was common in many taverns, especially where beans were cheap and plentiful. Beans baked slowly with molasses or maple syrup when available, and a bit of pork for flavor, served with dense bread. People ate it because it was affordable and could be made in large batches. It mattered because it fed a crowd without expensive meat. The human detail is the dark, sticky top crust of the beans, the part everyone secretly wanted. From beans, another humble legume stepped forward, one that could thicken a pot into something almost spoon-proof. Peas porridge was made from dried peas simmered until they broke down into a thick, hearty mash, often flavored with a bit of pork or bone. People ate it because dried peas were cheap, stored well, and filled the stomach fast. It mattered because it was survival food for cold days and crowded rooms. The human detail is the heavy spoonful, the kind that makes a bowl feel like an anchor when the outside world is wind and mud. And what came next was even more tied to the meeting of cultures in early America. Succotash was built from corn and beans, often with squash, and sometimes with a little fat or meat for depth. It reflects indigenous foodways that blended into colonial kitchens over time. People ate it because corn and beans were reliable crops that could be eaten fresh or dried for later. It mattered because it provided balanced nourishment when meat was limited. The human detail is the color in the pot, pale beans and yellow corn, like a small brightness in a smoky room. From succotash, tavern meals often leaned into cornmeal breads that cooked fast and stretched whatever else was on the table. Johnny cakes were simple cornmeal cakes cooked on a griddle, sometimes with a bit of flour, salt, and fat. They were served with stews, beans, or a drizzle of molasses in some homes. People ate them because cornmeal was affordable and widely available, and Johnny cakes could be made quickly when a wave of travelers arrived. They mattered because bread made every meal feel bigger. The human detail is the browned edge, crisp from the griddle, eaten hot enough to warm your fingers. And if Johnny cakes were the crisp version, another cornmeal bread showed up thicker and softer, especially in rural taverns. Corn pone was a simple baked or skillet-cooked cornmeal bread, sometimes made with buttermilk when available. It was plain, sturdy, and made for dipping. People ate it because it was cheap, filling, and paired with everything. It mattered because it turned a sack of cornmeal into days of meals for locals and travelers alike. The human detail is the crumble, pieces breaking off into stew and thickening the broth as you eat. Now we move from bread into something colonial taverns serve in bowls, sometimes as both food and comfort. Hasty pudding, also known as cornmeal mush, was cornmeal cooked into a thick porridge. It could be served savory with salt and drippings, or sweetened with molasses when the kitchen could spare it. People ate it because it was cheap, warm, and reliable. It mattered because it fed many mouths with minimal ingredients. The human detail is the slow stirring by the cook, watching the pot carefully so it does not scorch, because even the simplest meal demanded attention. From hasty pudding, taverns often offered another thick bowl that felt like an old-world echo, especially among communities that carried those habits across the ocean. Oatmeal porridge was cooked with water or milk when available, seasoned simply, and served hot to late arrivals who needed warmth more than variety. People ate it because it was filling and gentle, and it required no meat. It mattered because it kept costs low while still offering something comforting. The human detail is the bowl held close with both hands, because the heat mattered as much as the flavor. Now, if you traveled inland, you might see more game on tavern tables, depending on the season and the local hunters. Venison stew used deer meat simmered with onions, herbs, and sometimes root vegetables. Tough cuts softened with time, and the broth grew richer as it cooked. People ate it because venison could be plentiful in certain regions, and stew made it stretch. It mattered because it provided protein without relying on domestic livestock alone. The human detail is the way the room quiets when hot stew arrives, because hunger does not need conversation. And what came next was even more portable, the kind of meal that could be eaten quickly and then carried back onto the road. Venison pasties were pastry pockets filled with venison, onions, and sometimes turnips or potatoes in later versions. They were baked until firm and could travel well. People ate them because they were convenient for travelers who could not linger long at a common table. It mattered because tavern food often had to serve both the dining room and the road. The human detail is the crust flaking onto a sleeve as someone eats standing near the door, already thinking about the next mile. From venison, smaller game sometimes appeared, especially in places where taverns depended on whatever local hunters brought in. Rabbit stew with dumplings was made from rabbit simmered with onions and whatever vegetables were available, then finished with dumplings made from flour and water. People ate it because rabbit could be hunted and stew made lean meat feel satisfying. It mattered because it turned local game into a communal meal without great expense. The human detail is the careful chewing because small bones were expected and nobody made a show of it. Now, tavern meals were not only about meat. They were also about what could be stored and served with very little waste. Cheese, bread, and pickles was a simple tavern offering. A wedge of cheese, thick slices of bread, and pickled vegetables or onions for bite. People ate it because it was quick, cheap, and required little cooking. It mattered because taverns needed foods that could be served even when the kitchen fire was low. The human detail is the shared loaf passed down the table and the knife scraping against a worn wooden board. In some taverns, that cheese plate turned into something warmer and more filling, especially when eggs and dairy were available. Cheese and onion pie was a savory pie made from cheese, onions, eggs when available, and a simple crust. Not every tavern served it, and recipes varied. People ate it because cheese provided protein and richness, while onions were cheap flavor. It mattered because it offered variety without relying on expensive meat. The human detail is the brown top, blistered slightly, smelling comforting the moment it lands on the table. From pies, we move to a dish built around the idea that nothing should be wasted, not even the scraps from carving. Mutton hash was made from chopped leftover mutton or lamb, mixed with potatoes or turnips, warmed and browned on a pan. In some places, it was softer like a mash. In others, it was crisp for texture. People ate it because leftovers had value, and hash turned them into a fresh meal. It mattered because thrift kept taverns running and kept travelers fed. The human detail is the crisp edge scraped from the pan, eaten first because it tastes like effort. And if mutton was scarce, taverns still had ways to make a hearty bowl from humble ingredients. Onion and bread pottage was soup built from onions cooked in fat, water or broth, and chunks of bread that thickened the bowl. It was simple, warming, and filling, and it could be made quickly for late arrivals. People ate it because bread was always around and onions stored well. It mattered because it turned pantry scraps into comfort without needing meat. The human detail is the bread dissolving into broth as the bowl sits, growing thicker as you eat. Now let's shift to a food people sometimes forget was a colonial staple, especially in coastal taverns and river towns. Clam broth with hard bread was often plain, built from clams simmered into a briny broth and served with bread for dipping. Not always chowder, sometimes just hot salt water with substance. People ate it because clams could be gathered and cooked quickly, and broth warmed cold hands fast. It mattered because taverns needed quick meals made from local supply. The human detail is the careful chew because coastal food sometimes carried a little grit, a tiny reminder of the shore. From a shoreline back to the hearth, taverns often serve a dish that bridged breakfast and supper. Fried mush with molasses began as cornmeal mush cooked earlier, cooled, sliced, and fried until crisp. Then it was topped with molasses for sweetness. People ate it because cornmeal was cheap and the fried texture made it feel special. It mattered because it turned the same ingredients into a new meal, which mattered when supplies were repetitive. The human detail is the molasses, dark and slow, poured in a thin ribbon over a hot slice while the fire pops behind you. Now we enter the sweet side of the tavern, the part many travelers remembered most, because sweetness meant comfort and scarcity at the same time. Gingerbread made with molasses was a common tavern treat, sturdy and filling. Flour, molasses, ginger, and sometimes other spices when they were available. People ate it because molasses was a common sweetener and gingerbread kept well, which mattered for busy taverns. It mattered because a small sweet could lift spirits after a hard road. The human detail is the dense crumb, slightly sticky, and the way it pairs with a warm drink like it was designed for cold nights. And if gingerbread was portable sweetness, another dessert was built for the hearth and for patience. Indian pudding was cornmeal cooked with milk when available, sweetened with molasses, and baked slowly until it became rich and comforting. Many families remembered it as a dish that cooked while life continued around it. People ate it because it used common ingredients and made a little dairy feel like luxury. It mattered because it offered tradition and warmth in a hard world. The human detail is the spice, often just a hint, rising from the bowl like a quiet memory. From pudding, another dessert appeared that was as much about thrift as it was about taste. Bread pudding was made from stale bread soaked in milk, sweetened when possible, and baked until set. Some taverns added dried fruit or spice when they had it. People ate it because stale bread was never wasted, and pudding turned it into something comforting. It mattered because it stretched ingredients and reduced waste, which kept tavern meals affordable. The human detail is the warm spoonful, soft enough for tired travelers, served without fuss, but with real comfort. And what came next was even more tied to the orchard and the way colonial cooks stretched fruit through seasons. Apple pandowdy was apples cooked down under a simple crust, rustic and imperfect by design. The crust might be broken and pushed down as it baked, letting syrup bubble up through cracks. People ate it because apples were common and stored well, and the dessert used simple pantry ingredients. It mattered because it offered sweetness without expensive imports. The human detail is the cracked top, not pretty, but honest, with apple syrup shining through in the firelight. Now we reach a tavern sweet that could feel surprisingly refined, depending on what the house had. Syllabub was a frothy mixture of cream and sweetened wine or cider in some versions, served as a treat when dairy and drink were available. Not every tavern offered it, and recipes varied widely. People ate it because it felt delicate in a rough room, like a brief softness. It mattered because taverns serve celebration as well as hunger. The human detail is the careful handling of the cup, set down gently even on a crowded table. And finally, we end with a dish that feels plain until you taste it, and then you understand why it lasted. Stewed apples with cheese was warm apples cooked until soft, served with a slice of sharp cheese and bread. Sweet and salty together, easy to serve, easy to eat. People ate it because it used stored fruit and preserved dairy and required little fuel. It mattered because it offered balance when meals leaned heavy and plain. The human detail is the contrast on the tongue, warm apple against cool cheese, like comfort coming from two directions at once. By the time you step back from these 25 colonial tavern meals, you start to see what the tavern really was. It was not a restaurant in the modern sense. It was a public hearth and a social engine. A place where you could warm up by the fire, eat at a common table, hear the latest news pinned to the wall, and rest for the night upstairs if there was room. A place where mugs were filled from the bar, where games passed time, and where community sometimes held meetings because the tavern was the one space built for gathering. And what many people forget is that these meals carried more than calories. They carried connection. They brought strangers into the same light. They turned a dangerous road into something manageable, one stop at a time. Even when the food was plain, the act of being fed mattered. Maybe that is why these forgotten tavern meals still feel so vivid today, because they remind us that history is not only made in grand halls and famous events. Sometimes it is made in a smoky room with a hot pot on the hearth, where ordinary people shared bread, traded news, and found the strength to face the next mile. Before restaurants existed, America still ate out. It just did in firelight, with steam in the air, and a simple meal that said the same thing again and again. You made it here. Sit down, get warm,